Thanks a lot, Karina, for organizing this session and for having me. It's appropriate that I'm here with Karina today because she actually helped collect some of this data back in 2010. So she's going to be seeing it for the first time, along with many of you. So this is a portion of my dissertation research that I did in collaboration with Hugh Safford, Susan Harrison, and my advisor, Andrew Ladd. And we were interested in the question of how different disturbance regimes could contribute to understory plant community diversity, in particular this question of thermophilization, which I'll address in a minute. So ecologists in general are often really interested in understanding shifts in plant communities over large temporal scales and large spatial scales. And a common way to do this, a common place to do this is in montane systems where relevant climatic gradients are spatially compressed. And one common way that a number of researchers have done this is to resample historical plots over time in montane regions. And so if you sample a historical plot and then resample a modern plot, a number of authors have found that the species composition in modern plots tends to include more species with the center of their range at lower elevations. And so they interpret this as evidence of a warming climatic niche, and they've termed this process thermophilization. So it's basically you can think of it as a shift of the plant community towards species with a warmer climatic niche. But we are interested in thinking about this question in the context of forests because, as we know, forests play an important role in mediating the sort of regional macroclimate at a microclimatic scale. So for instance, when you increase forest cover, you induce a number of changes at the understory level, including increased solar radiation, increased soil surface temperature, often decreases in temperature and radiation with increased forest cover, and increases in humidity as well. So you have a number of changes that are going to be relevant to plant species which are occurring at a smaller spatial scale than is captured by regional climatic variation. And a group of authors looked at this in a recent paper. Dufresne and colleagues quantified this thermophilization process over time, resampling historical plots across a network of forested plots in Europe. And they found that although continental-wide there was evidence for thermophilization, so shift towards warmer climate species, they found that this process was accelerated in areas that had become more open over time and was less in areas that had become more densely forested over time. So there's evidence here that what's going on with forests can influence what's going on with the plant community in the understory. We wanted to look at this question in a different context and ask, what about changes in forest cover not over century-long timescales, but over shorter spatial timescales and shorter temporal timescales? And we're doing this by looking at changes to disturbance severity over relatively small spatial gradients. So we're going to be considering the question of what happens when you increase disturbance severity. In this case, we're mostly going to be focusing on fire severity. Do we see a corresponding increase in thermophilization in the understory plant community? So I'll be addressing three specific questions here. The first is whether we can detect thermophilization via canopy disturbance, particularly by fire, using a slightly different approach to what some of those other authors used and looking at species biogeographical information. Second, we're going to be looking at some potential mechanisms of community shifts, and particularly the importance of water deficit on influencing community composition. And third, I'll touch briefly at the end on what some of the outcomes of this process might be for community-level diversity. So, like Karina mentioned, we're going to be transitioning from the chaparral to the forest. This research was primarily in Sierra Nevada yellow pine and mixed conifer forests, which I suspect many of you are familiar with. These are forests in eastern California from the Southern Cascades down to San Bernardino and Angeles Mountains in Southern California, but primarily in Sierra Nevada. And they are dominated by the yellow pines, Jeffrey and ponderosa pine, with a component of other conifers in the canopy. And the important thing for the purposes of this talk is that this is a frequent fire system. There's lots of evidence to suggest that the fire return interval in this system is on the order of 10 to 15 years, depending on local site conditions. And so this is a dominant ecological process historically in these forests, and the contemporary challenge that they face in many areas is fire suppression. So this has led to serious or to large-scale structural changes in these forests involving the infilling of trees and increase in canopy cover. So the process of putting out fires has transformed the structure of these forests from a more open, heterogeneous structure to a much more homogeneous and closed canopy structure. And one of the primary management approaches to dealing with this challenge is to restore the structure associated with historically frequent fires, and in so doing, hopefully make them more resilient to recurring wildfires. So this involves the process of fuel treatments, which we're going to be looking at in this study, which involves taking out generally smaller diameter trees and then doing some sort of surface fuel treatment with a pile burn or a prescribed broadcast burn. So for this study, we looked at 12 different sites across this yellow pine mixed conifer forest ecosystem. And importantly, these sites were arranged across the full precipitation gradient of this forest type. So it's a pretty strong range. Some of these mixed conifer sites are much more productive, on the order of 180 centimeters of precipitation per year. Some of the yellow pine dominated sites, particularly on the east side of the Sierra Nevada crest, are much drier with an average of 40 centimeters of precipitation a year. And at each of these 12 sites, we took advantage of a sort of natural experiment where we had a factorial combination of fuel treatments and wildfire. So what this looks like on the ground is we opportunistically sampled fires that had burned through treatments. So we had areas that had not received any fire and had also not received any treatment. So this is sort of the baseline condition for many of Sierra Nevada forests: high tree density, high canopy cover. We call these class 1 forests. And then we sampled nearby areas where these untreated, unburned forests burned in wildfire. And these were generally high severity wildfires. So these were wildfires that were burning under extreme fire weather conditions. And so we term these class 4 forests. So this is sort of the bracket other end of the disturbance spectrum. And then in between, we have these two classes that had received fuels treatments. So class 2 forests received fuels treatments, and then they didn't burn in the wildfire. And then class 3 received fuels treatments and then subsequently burned in wildfire. So these were generally low to moderate severity fires. So you can see visually what this factorial combination looks like here. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be arranging them on sort of a linear continuum of disturbance severity. So from class 1 to class 4, we have increasing disturbance severity. These two classes had wildfire. And associated with this, we have some other work out to show that the changes are basically what you would expect. So as you increase disturbance severity, you're seeing a decrease in canopy cover, you're seeing a decrease in litter depth and litter cover, an increase in bare ground cover in the 2 to 3 year period after fire. So we sampled across these 12 sites, we sampled a total of 664 12 square meter plots in each of these, across these 4 classes. And we ended up with a total of 332 native species. And for each of the native species, we assigned them a biogeographic affinity, and that's what we're going to be looking at as our indicator of shifts in community composition. So this notion of biogeographic affinity comes from some important work by Raven and Axelrod in 1978. There's a book that they wrote on this topic, which is actually for sale at the CNPS booth if you want to take a closer look at it. But then this idea came back into sort of the ecological literature, starting with a paper by Susan Harrison and Jim Grace, where they looked at biogeographic affinity as a good predictor of community composition along a precipitation and productivity gradient in California. So we wanted to extend this idea to a disturbance gradient. And the idea here is basically that Axelrod and Raven classified a large portion of the California flora according to the time period and region in which it diversified. So they have this one large group which they call the arcto-tertiary geoflora, and Harrison and Grace, and we're adopting their nomenclature. We're calling it the North-temperate flora. So this basically consists of families and genera that diversified during wetter portions of the tertiary, so the Eocene epoch and thereabouts. And the center of their present diversity is generally in sort of north-temperate regions of North America, although there's been radiation subsequent to that into drier areas. And these are characterized by a host of sort of north-temperate to boreal understory species, including Amelanchier, Lupinus, Prunus, Ranunculus, Viola. There are many more. You can check out the Harrison and the Raven Natural book if you're interested. And then on the flip side of that, we lumped 3 of their classifications into what we're calling the southern xeric flora. So we basically have a north temperate group and a southern xeric group. This again follows the Harrison and Grace approach. So Raven and Axelrod had these 3 categories. The California floristic province, this is a group of species and genera often that diversified during subsequent to the Pliocene onset of the Mediterranean climate in California, so when things really started to dry out in California. And then there's two other groups that sort of moved into California following the onset of the Mediterranean climate. So there's an interior desert group, which diversified to the east and the south, and then also a Madrid tertiary group, which diversified during the drier periods of the tertiary and often to the southeast of California as well. So we're mostly going to be focusing on the balance between the north temperate flora and the southern xeric flora, in particular looking at how these two groups respond to this change in disturbance severity. So I'll jump right into the results here and show that, as you would expect, we saw a strong and significant decrease in the relative proportion of north temperate species as you increase disturbance severity. So these are our 4 disturbance classes arranged from low severity to high severity, left to right. And the range in the proportion of the species pool in the understory that is from the north temperate zone, which is what's shown on the y-axis here, ranges from around 70% in our undisturbed condition to less than 40% in the high severity disturbance, high severity fire condition. So we're really seeing a strong signal of a shift towards this southern xeric group and away from the north temperate group with each successive sort of whack that we take at the forest, from fuels treatments to low severity fire to high severity fire. And so then we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into this and consider some potential mechanisms that are driving this. And we really, in particular, are interested in this role of climatic water deficit and at a microclimatic scale, so as mediated by forest canopy. And so the idea is that some of these southern xeric species are really responding to the drier conditions in particular, and that's some things that, that's a piece of information that Harrison and Grace showed at a regional scale. So when you disturb a forest, there's a couple different directions that soil moisture can go in. You can get wetter by reducing canopy transpiration and therefore increasing soil moisture. But you can also get drier by increasing evapotranspirational demand at the understory level. So you're increasing radiation, you're increasing temperature, so yeah, maybe your soil moisture goes up a little bit, but maybe your evaporational demand goes up a lot. So we tested this a couple different ways. The first was just to take advantage of this large-scale gradient in precipitation that we had at our sites. And so the idea here is that we're looking to look at our sites on a precipitation gradient from 40 to 180 centimeters per year. And we know that some of our other work showed that as we increase precipitation, we're increasing canopy cover at our sites here. So as we move to the right here, canopy cover is increasing in undisturbed forest. So there's a couple different hypotheses that we might have about how the proportion of north temperate flora would respond to this precipitation gradient. The first is that if it's really surface disturbance that's driving thermophilization, so if canopy cover is not having any sort of effect, we might expect that the proportion of north temperate flora would sort of hold constant across this precipitation gradient. So even though canopy cover is getting denser as we move out here, it's really just the fact that we're disturbing the soil and moving some of the litter that's causing this shift towards southern xeric species and high severity disturbances, and they wouldn't really respond to canopy cover. We might also expect that canopy cover is driving the shift by affecting floor temperature, but not water deficit. So in this case, in our undisturbed forest, we're increasing canopy cover as we get more productive. And so we might expect the north temperate flora responding to that. But in this high severity disturbance class, canopy cover is universally low across the board, regardless of what we started out with. We have data to support this. And so you might expect that north temperate flora will be low across the board as well. But if there's a role for water deficit, also we might expect that the north temperate flora responding both to canopy cover and to the annual precipitation amounts. And so in this case, even though this high severity fire group has low canopy cover across the board, these more productive sites have more annual precipitation, and so that might foster greater abundance of the north temperate group. And so when we confront this with the data, we find that it generally supports this third interpretation. And so I've added all 4 classes on here. And we see that particularly the unburned treatment, fuels treatments which had some fire and the control which had no fire, show a much stronger response to precipitation. But even in the areas where canopy cover is generally much lower, particularly the high severity fire class, we still see an increase in this north temperate group with precipitation. The other thing to note here is that, which is potentially interesting from a management perspective, is that the shift in community composition that you see with disturbance is much greater out at this end. So this makes sense. If you take a more productive forest and highly disturb it, you're causing a much greater change at the understory level than you are in a forest that started out with less precipitation and started out with lower productivity and that was much more open to begin with. We also took a look at the leaf functional traits of the species that we were studying. And so there's a well-established relationship between specific leaf area and leaf carbon to nitrogen, which is basically that species tend to be correlated along an axis from high SLA, which is large leaves per leaf mass, and high nitrogen or low carbon to nitrogen. So species up here tend to be fast-growing resource capturing species, and species down here, which tend to have heavier leaves for how big they are and more carbon relative to how much nitrogen they have, tend to be slower growing and resource conserving species, and often pretty good at conserving water. So we did an analysis, a regression of the community weighted mean trait values for all our plots. So these are, each point is a plot here, and this is the average community weight, abundance weighted mean SLA and mean carbon nitrogen ratio. And we see that it follows the expected correlation, where some plots are dominated by species that have high SLA and low C to N ratios. But when we test the regressions, when we test the residuals of each of these groups against the regression line for all the plots pulled together, we found that the high severity wildfire class was significantly more likely to have negative residuals. So plots in high severity areas fall much more frequently below this line, which suggests that they have a lower SLA for how much nitrogen the leaves have. And so this suggests potentially an adaptation to conserve water while still taking advantage of some of the increased light resources that follow disturbance. So this is another piece of evidence that suggests that water stress may be driving this shift towards the southern xeric group. And lastly, I'll just touch briefly on the consequences of this for diversity. So we looked at both plot level and stand level diversity. So this is plot level diversity. This is a Shannon Unit Diversity Index for the 4 disturbance classes. And we see a significant increase in plot level diversity, so basically something the size of this stage. There's more species in this plot with increased disturbance, although these two groups are not significantly different. So this is consistent with the idea that these species, generally these forests, see increases in diversity when you initiate some disturbance. But interestingly, when we looked at beta diversity at the stand scale, so this is within a disturbance class, within a site, how different are the plots within that stand from each other? We see that high severity plots have significantly lower beta diversity than the other 3 groups. So this means that even though high severity fire plots have high local richness, the plots within that stand tend to be much more similar to each other than plots in these other 3 categories. And so when we combine these to get a stand level estimate of diversity, or a gamma diversity index, we see the predicted intermediate disturbance peak, which is classes 2 and 3, so fuel treatments and fuel treatments plus wildfire have the highest stand scale diversity. And also, this is the group right here with the most equitable balance between north-temperate and southern xeric flora. So a few points to take away from this. We see that increasing canopy disturbance causes a shift towards the southern xeric flora. And this is occurring at small spatial scales of 1 to 2 kilometers, and it's short time periods, so 2 to 3 years post-fire. Microclimate appears to be important in driving this change in community composition. Particularly, we see an important role for microclimatic water deficit. And we see a stand scale diversity peak at intermediate disturbances. And we think what's going on here is that, on the one hand, you're getting maximum coexistence between the north-temperate and southern xeric groups. And also, when you're introducing fire into areas that have been fuels treated, you tend to get a lot more heterogeneity in canopy cover, which may facilitate some areas of higher canopy cover and some areas of lower canopy cover. So thanks to all the people who have made this possible, including Karina. And if I have any time, I'll be happy to